So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and due to a couple of things, on a day where I would normally be recording I actually have slightly less time today, so we're going to be doing a smaller battle, but there was calls for another pitch battle in one of the comments of my recent videos, so I suppose ask and ye shall receive on this occasion, because at least now I have the perfect opportunity to take advantage of a replay like this. This is actually a themed battle as well, so in spite of the fact it's not one of the set-piece large sieges, at the very least we do have that going for us, and it is a combination of Arthedain, played by Blue Ranger, and Amroth, played by Bilbo Baggins of all people, going up against an evil men combination of Black Númenórean, who is playing as Khand, and Kimonos, playing as Umbar. Anyway, so yeah, I think people at this point who have followed me for any length of time know my opinions on the grassy plain. I should hasten to add that it's not really a hatred of the map overall, it's just that I've covered it so much at this point that it really is quite difficult to get excited about a map such as this. And also, just from a sort of numbers perspective, I suppose, this is a map that isn't generally received all that well on the channel, to be honest with you, because generally speaking a lot of people will tune in a little bit more for the spectacle of things, maybe not the players who actually play the game and who sort of have been around for a little while. Maybe they will appreciate the nuances of a game on a map like this, that a map like this can actually produce, but generally speaking, for most of the people on my channel, it's probably a little bit bland to sit through and watch a battle on this map. But again, it's all about differing tastes, I suppose, and considering the situation today where I can't actually record anything else, we are going to be having a little look at this. So it is going to be much more about the tactics, much more about the play. I would say that a map like Grassy Plain actually, as much as it does offer a neutral venue, it doesn't actually offer as much variation as I think people say that it does, to be honest with you. A lot of the time it will come down to just a case of, will you commit all of your resources at the right time or not? And that really is kind of it. The other way that you can play the game is just try and get your cavalry around the flank. But other than that, I've seen very little, especially in more recent times, that obviously nothing really takes me by surprise on a map like this anymore. Even with the vast amount of variation in all the factions, especially in Reforged at this point. For example, Khand and Umbar here are very different in terms of the strengths they offer. Even Arthedain and Amroth, who are a little bit more similar to one another, but obviously Amroth a lot more focused around their cavalry, whereas Arthedain have got a little bit more in the archer department. But yeah, it's even with that level of faction variation, I very rarely see anything new on a battle like this, and if it is, it's usually because one player has done something wrong and the other player is able to exploit it more through luck than skill. But anyway, enough of me talking about the Grassy Plain, because I do feel as though I do need to explain myself with regards to Grassy Plain a little bit, because I feel as though with the way that I've talked about it, especially a little bit more recently, I think people may be misunderstanding me. It is also the same. It's the same sort of thing with non-themed battles. I personally don't really have too much of a problem with it, but it is about, you know, doing. Generally speaking, I will show stuff that tends to be watched more on the channel, because ultimately that's, you know, the numbers don't lie. You know, I'm going to spend my time doing things that people want to see more than things that they aren't. Generally speaking, and the Grassy Plain often is not that normally. But who knows, you know, the theme may make up for that a little bit. But let's go through the forces of good first and foremost, with the blue team starting off with Bilbo Baggins. He is playing as Amroth. He's got some Dorananal archers on the front line with the armour upgrade as well, so they'll be pretty decent at skirmishing. To be fair though, I think of all of the factions on display today, in terms of a just long, drawn-out, slow-paced skirmish fight, Amroth are the least equipped to deal with that, and they also have the least reasons, I think, to actually engage in that sort of thing, considering their strengths elsewhere. But just one unit there on the front. Over on the side, the Arthedain marksmen, who are actually going to be slightly better at skirmishing over a longer period of time, but only 58 of them in the unit. So obviously this is a smaller scale map as well. Actually, it's quite a rarity as well, to be honest with you, to see the unit scaling turned down to this extent. This will tend to favour more elite units as well, I would say. So the Arthedain marksmen might actually be even better in a skirmish fight than they normally are. Out here on the flank, a combination of Dorananal Swordsman. It's very rare that you'll see a unit of militia sub 100 unit count, and some Dorananal pikemen as well with the armour upgrade. So again, a more cost-effective frontline, or at least a frontline focused around that sort of thing, being built there. some Tarnostian spearmen with some Athelond men-at-arms mixed in there, so again a slightly higher quality phalanx in the fact that you have a little bit more mass behind the spears, and the polearm unit itself as well. The Athelond halberdiers are actually pretty good for the class of unit they are. Like, as a halberdier, they tend to perform pretty well, whereas the pikes are a little bit more run-of-the-mill for Dol Amroth. Then just in behind, we're going to start to get into some of the stronger units, so we have some Untitled Champions here. Obviously a unit of Heavy Swordsman. Heavy Swordsman is the area of infantry where Dol Amroth actually do pack a bit of a punch. The Untitled Champions cause fear, as well as being a very accomplished unit in melee in their own right. And then there is, of course, the Haven Guard just in behind them. Obviously, no shield, so you do have to be a little bit careful, even with Dol Amroth's armour values being what they are at the higher end, which is pretty good. You do still need to protect them a little bit more, and it remains to be seen whether they can actually do that. A lot of their infantry they brought today is actually unshielded. Only the lowest tier infantry they have available to them in the Tarnostian Spearmen and the Dorananal Swordsmen have shields. So if they do get caught out, especially by a faction like Khand, I have to say, things could get a little bit dicey for them. But back here we also have the Haven Knights, which if I knew I was facing off against Khand as Dol Amroth, this would be a no-brainer to bring, because Khand don't actually have a cavalry unit that can solo the Haven Knights 1v1. The best they could hope to do is try and kite them down, and even then with the heavy armour, shields, multiple HP, it's going to take them a long time to do that. And if they're spending time shooting at the Haven Knights, they're not spending time shooting at some of the more vulnerable assets like the Heavy Swordsman. But even so, you do need to support them because they can only do so much and there are only so many of them. A couple of units of Knights of the Silver Swan to do that. An interesting choice as well. Generally speaking, they're going to be best when they're crashing into heavily fortified infantry positions that are sands, spears or pikes. Interesting to see how they hold up here. Their armour should actually mean they can take a fair amount of punishment, even in melee against Khandish cavalry, but that might not be the most efficient use of them. We shall see. His ally, meanwhile, Arthedain, probably has a few hidden units, to be fair. The Royal Court of House Armlather are multiple HP Lancer, so they're not a unit of knights, but they are still going to be very, very strong, tough to bring down, but again, more of a focus around destroying infantry, which, to be fair, against Umbar is probably a slightly better use of your funds. I'd be kind of surprised if we didn't see the Knights of Anubis as well, though, and indeed we do, so he's gone for both of those units there, so both the higher end cavalry units for Arthedain, in spite of the fact that the Lancers, or the regular Lancers, have been made a little bit stronger in the recent patch. You still don't see people taking them an awful lot, and I feel as though that is because while they are now not useless like they used to be, they will actually not rout when you use them how they're intended to be used. There is still a little bit of... The case can be made that why would you bring them? Like, when you've got Knights of Anubis and Royal Court of House Armlathe here, yes, there are going to be less of them, and yes, you're investing a lot in them, but generally speaking, in terms of value for money, the proposition still isn't really there for regular Lancers most of the time. These units are going to accomplish far more. Even though you do pay a lot for them, they're still going to really be the better choice most of the time. And the Knights of Numinous, obviously, especially considering how tanky they are. And they're going to be backed up by some Dunedain scouts. As far as horse archers go, they're lightly armoured, so they won't do too well skirmishing with the Khandish horse archers. But if they can avoid them, should they be present, they should do fairly well, actually, if they get in and around the Umbar formation, obviously. But Umbar have got foot archers that can deal with them as well, so we shall have to see. A couple of units of Evendim archers on the front line. They haven't deployed their stakes, but actually they can't deploy stakes, can they? Can't remember which way round it is, but some of Arthedain's archers can't. They do have the armour upgrade though, so actually they will trade reasonably efficiently actually with something like the Belagire archers, but that is a real wet noodle fight between those two. Essentially nothing of value will be lost or gained if you engage in a long-ended skirmish between these two particular units, but yeah, I mean, at the very least, you're making it more difficult for Umbar to play the long-range game that they want to, which is to soften you up and then roll forward with superior infantry. Having said that, Arthedain normally are able to exert a little bit more pressure in the range game. It doesn't look like that's what Arthedain are going to do here. There's two units of Arthedain men-at-arms on both flanks. Interesting to see swordsmen on the flanks rather than spears. They don't have the armour upgrades either, but they'll do okay. I mean, they're decent value for money for men-at-arms, but against Umbar, I mean, infantry is definitely an area where Umbar can really lay down a bit of a marker against Arthedain, unless Arthedain are willing to spend a lot. And to be fair, the Dunedain Peacekeepers shouldn't do too badly. Against most of the more basic Umbar troops, they should do pretty well for themselves. The superior skill as well on Dunedain units should mean against even the Balakith units they should do pretty nicely. But it's where they start running into stuff like Alcarondas Legion where they probably will start to suffer because their lower melee defense from having an axe as their weapon is probably going to be exploited pretty ruthlessly by something like the Alcarondas Legion. And even their superior, well, their slightly better skill from being Dunedain is not going to be enough to make up for that, I don't think. but we'll see. I mean, it depends on Umbar's composition, to be fair. Arthedain pikemen, without the armour upgrade, still should be pretty decent, though, at forming up a pretty good front line with the pikes and the peacekeepers here. I just question if this is a wise move, because if Umbar do invest heavily in their infantry, you won't win the front line as Arthedain, really. Something like the Wardens of the North should help them really secure the cavalry game, however, investing a lot in their cav. If they can start sniping out any mounted units that Umbar may have brought, or even Khan, if they bring them over here, definitely going to be a useful thing. And in the late game, of course, they can pull out those swords and be a difference maker as well. And then over on this side, we have the Dismounted Knights for Numerous, which is where the general is. He's going to be sitting in the middle of the line. Again, strong. If Umbar have invested in their high-tier infantry, though, and they meet on the field, something like the Harbingers of Castamere, even with how tanky the Dismounted Knights of Numerous are, that will still be a bit of a problem. And it's a reasonably safe place to put your general, as long as you keep them near to the pikes, so cavalry can't charge into them. Over here, meanwhile, a bit more tightly packed for Umbar and Khan, which makes a little bit more sense. You want to sort of wrap yourself around the sort of really heavy-duty Umbar core, and allow Khan to sort of cycle around the edge with their very numerous cavalry, which is something Umbar, of course, lack. And then it can be a pretty difficult thing. I think these two factions do synergize quite well together. I think Dol Amroth and Arthedain are a little bit too similar in many ways. I think that Arthedain can make up for Dol Amroth's lack of archers to a certain extent, or lack of like really efficient archers, I'll say. Whereas Dol Amroth's cavalry, like Arthedain, don't really struggle for cavalry anyway, to be honest with you. If there is a weakness both of them have, it's the fact that they have instances of strong infantry, but they don't have sort of a universally strong infantry corps. Arthedain maybe do slightly better at that because they have a few more options, but they can't bring all of them at once, so it is still a bit of a problem. Whereas Umbar, of course, certainly don't struggle with that. That's one of the main strengths of the faction as a whole. They've got some Corsair Blackguards on the front line. I'd be a little bit surprised if they remain out here, although having a look at this composition, this to me is a rush build by the looks of things, because there are no archers. The only range units they have are the Blackguards, which are very damaging, of course, but they'll throw their javelins, expend their ammunition very quickly, and then be sort of makeshift line infantry in melee. Just in behind, we have the upgraded Balakith Shield Bearers in combination with the Belagite Pikemen. The Shield Bearers are probably the most underwhelming unit of Balakith units. The Axe Guard definitely have their place, and we'll talk about them in a minute because they're just in behind. The Marksmen are really efficient in a skirmish fight as well because of how bulky they really are. The Shield Bearers, though, while they are AP, which the Alcarondas Legion do lack, they don't tend to perform as well as something like the Flag Rim. They always tend to perform slightly worse, even with the armour upgrade. But the AP will still be universally useful against both the factions they're facing off against, and the Pikes are also there, so an interesting matchup there with the Peacekeepers and the Arthedain Pikes. I'd back Arthedain there, but of course Umbar have got more in terms of infantry they brought to the table. The Balakith Axe Guard in particular with the armour upgrade, I'm a fan of them because they actually have better melee defense than quite a few other heavy axemen of this type. Even something like the Rohirrim Westmark Marshals actually don't have as good a melee skill as the Balakith Axe Guard. Now they do have lighter armour as a result, even with the armour upgrade actually, they're still found a little bit wanting in that regard. The Balakith, that is something to bear in mind, like in comparison to the other sort of upper end Umbar units, unless you upgrade their armour, they are actually fairly fragile. So upgrading the armour is obviously quite important, less so for the Marksmen because they have the shield obviously in their favour as well as the Shield Bearers, but for the Axe Guard in particular, definitely need to bulk them up if you want them to survive any length of time. Alcarondas Legion, definitely a must-have if you're going to go for a really aggressive Umbar play like this, purely because obviously the strength they offer on the front line. There's very few factions that are going to be able to deploy line infantry in the way that Umbar can, because even factions that have got better line infantry, for example the Imladris Guardians, they can't bring them in as greater numbers as the Alcarondas Legion, so it is very difficult really. There are factions that can do it. Imladris are one, to be fair, and Khazad-dûm are another, that can outmuscle Umbar if they both go full infantry. A lot of that does come down to how they're played, however. It's definitely not impossible for Umbar to come out victorious there, but in this situation, Umbar are definitely of the four factions on the field today the ones that can field the most well-rounded and strongest infantry corps, and that's definitely the case here from Kim's army. Simunos? Well, regardless, he also has some Alcarondas Faithful, which are melee knights, similar in the amount of power they have actually to the Haven Knights. Haven Knights maybe have the slight edge in a 1v1, but you kind of expect that from Dol Amroth, but this, more of a defensive edge, this cavalry unit. Whether they can keep their entire backline covered from multiple cavalry units remains to be seen, because actually the rush here could be a little bit too risky for my blood. Considering you're going up against Dol Amroth, if you rush in, there's always going to be gaps that cavalry can exploit, and if the lancers are ready, then they can definitely do so. But perhaps Umbar is counting on the support of his ally over here in Khan, Black Numenorean playing as them. Nurad Retainers, which are basic melee cavalry, but they're superior in pretty much every way to something like the basic mercenary cavalry, which is pretty much the baseline melee cavalry. When it comes to fighting on horseback against other cavalry, Khan have really got a lot of options. Even their most basic units are capable of putting up a decent fight, and the Nurad Retainers, shielded, decently armoured considering what Khan are. And yeah, they're going to be pretty efficient as long as they're backed up. Similar story with the Wain Riders of Khan, actually. They are another melee cavalry unit. Differences, a little bit more fragile, obviously, without a shield, the armour as well. It looks a little bit less impressive in terms of its ability to protect, even if they've got a little bit more in terms of detail on it, like little daggers and so on and so forth, a cape. But yeah, as long as they ride together, as long as they keep their numbers secure, Umbar can probably zone out 1, maybe 2 units of cavalry with his pikes if he positions his formation right. Khan is going to have to handle the rest, and with all of this melee cavalry on the front, 2 retainers, 1 Wain Rider unit, they should be just fine as long as they don't allow them to get shot. Just in behind some nomadic raiders. Good to see some archers on foot. It will allow them to engage and sort of, if they're all going to move forward all at once, they should be able to pick their targets. Double Amroth have got plenty of targets actually that are ripe for the picking, even for a unit of basic archers like the raiders. In behind some Nurad halberds as well. Obviously you're not going to want to charge into them with their halberds. In terms of their performance next to the Athelond halberdiers, I'd say the Athelond are probably slightly the higher quality unit, but I think you also pay more for them. So yeah, I mean pretty much halberds, generally speaking, you know what to expect from them. More archers actually in the nomadic infantry, very good in a skirmish fight actually. They should be able to hold their own against anything Dol Amroth has. I think actually only the Wardens of the North on the field today will be better in a skirmish fight than them, and that's not really the way you want to use them. Variag Bowman as well. There's a lot of archers. Considering how aggressive Umbar are going to be, it's going to be a bit chaotic, I think, to see whether or not Khan can actually make the most of this. But unless they do intend to be more defensive, unless Umbar does sort of back up and allows Khan to take the entirety of the skirmish on themselves, and then later on maybe they switch tactics, that could be an interesting move. But based on the frames, I think maybe someone is going to be really aggressive, and based on composition, I imagine that would be Umbar. Nurad footmen back here, an armour-piercing infantry unit. They tend to perform better than the Balakith shield bearers, I have to say. It might be down to the fact that Khan really don't have a line infantry unit other than the Nurad footmen that are like actually decent quality, but they definitely do a good job generally most of the time with those big shields as well, capable of absorbing a lot of punishment. More Wain Riders back here, and then a couple of higher quality units of cavalry. The Brotherhood of the Lance is something I'd save until later on. Huge amount of damage, but very glass cannony, very easy to kill off with archers. And if the Haven Knights get them as well, that's obviously going to be very bad for them. And then some Lance Knights as well, very similar in terms of their function to the Knights of Anuminus. We've already seen the Variag Cataphracts, albeit the Knights of Anuminus are slightly the tankier of the two. But the Variag Cataphracts have got far more support around them. So, without further ado, let's begin. I imagine we're going to be making some liberal use here of the half-speed feature. And yeah, you can actually see Umbar are not going to be moving forward incredibly aggressively. I actually quite like this. I quite like the fact that they seem to have made their armies to really try and complement one another. And if you were going to go for one faction to handle the vast majority of the infantry heavy lifting, you'd definitely go for Umbar. Both of them can skirmish fairly well, to be honest with you. But Umbar, of course, have got a lot more that they need to spend their money on. They've also got some Brotherhood of the Shadows Khan over here, which are an assassin unit, obviously. Very dangerous if you get them onto the right targets. But time will tell whether they can actually do that. It's a very dense formation over here as well. Like, the one thing that could be a bit of a problem is if Arthedain move forward to such an extent that they just bypass the Khan charges and instead go for something like the Belagai pikes. With the shielded units in front, they shouldn't have too much issues. With all the archers that Khan have brought, actually, I think of the two, I prefer the composition of the evil men, actually. All of these archers from Khan mean that I would say the blue team kind of have to be a little bit more aggressive, but if they do that, then it really comes down to how the players actually play. You know, you're not allowing the other team's composition to beat you at that point. You're forcing how they actually play the game to be the thing that determines whether or not you're successful or not. However, can't afford to be too complacent here. Corsair Blackguards are here. It may actually have been worth their while to allow that cavalry to charge into those archers then, because they've got so many disposable archers, and a blast from the Corsair Blackguards there. Like, Corsair Blackguards are pretty savage javelins, to say the least. They don't have much ammunition, but it may very well have been worth their while to actually go after the Royal Court House Armleth there. Well, I mean, if that was the Knights of Anuminus, I'd say definitely, but with the Royal Court, a little bit more debatable. I mean, this is a bit of a conundrum here for the blue team here, because they do not have the skirmish firepower to get through all of Khan's archers, by no means. Khan don't have any of their horse archers, which could come into play later on, but with all of their foot archers and their tankier ones as well, nomadic infantry in particular, are going to be more than capable of out-skirmishing anything. Even the Tirithea marksmen, they have superior armour and the like, but nomadic infantry have got those shields. There's also 2 units of them as well. Doranernal archers over there are also reloading. The cavalry is also here. And this is the thing, the blue team are going to have to move in. I think this battle will actually come down more than anything to how the blue team use their cavalry. Knights of the Silver Swan, Knights of Innuminus, and Royal Court of House Armlaith in particular because of their lances. If they get a few good charges onto the Umbar infantry, all of a sudden all of this defensive play will have been largely for nothing. And speaking of which, those Dunedain scouts doing a good job there at peeling away at some of that cavalry power there. The Wain Riders of Khan, obviously more melee cavalry. They need to get them out of there really. They can't afford to allow the Dunedain scouts to get good value off on all of this cav, especially not if it's against Brotherhood of the Lance. I'd say that's even more of a big loss there, because in the late game, of course, while I said the Lancers from the blue team could be very important, the same could also be said of the Brotherhood of the Lance. Like one good charge into something like the Perithal Champions or Haven Guard, and that's a huge amount of the infantry stopping power that the blue team have at their disposal. But certainly in the early phases of this fight, the blue team at the moment are content to skirmish. I think they will eventually come to the understanding that's probably not going to yield much in the way of results for them. Nurad Retainers charging in, they're maybe getting a little bit impetuous there, the Khandish player, because maybe thinking it was a good idea to charge into the Tirithea marksman, but with Tarnostian spearmen defending them, it wasn't really the case, so needless loss of some of the cavalry there. But again, Khan, it's an interesting composition this, because it's almost like ablative armour, in the sense that Khan, they won't mind taking too many losses here. They have an army which is almost designed to be a living shield for Umbar, and as long as they can deliver Umbar to the late game with enough of their power intact, then the infantry fight should go in their favour. A lot of Alcarondas Legion, a good amount of AP. The only thing that could be slightly dangerous is the high tier units, the Haven Guard, Dismounted Knights of Innuminus. They don't really have any of that over on this side of things. Nomadic infantry firing in there. They have enough, they have enough in terms of tools, I think, that they should be just fine. Especially considering what's around the high tier units, like Arthedain Pikemen, Arthedain Men-at-Arms. Dunedain Peacekeepers are alright, I suppose, but again, I just feel as though on balance it is an interesting situation that could develop. There's also the Nurad units which can also support in the late game as well. And their AP certainly won't go amiss either. A bit surprised the Arthedain Men-at-Arms are being targeted by archers, to be honest with you. The shield should be coming into effect, although if they tilt slightly more, they probably won't actually. Without the armour upgrade, they will be a little bit more vulnerable, and to be fair, at the lower unit counts as well, each volley of arrows is probably going to have more of an impact than it otherwise would. The pikes are actually a little bit clear of the Dunedain Peacekeepers at this point. This would be the unit I'd be going for, the pikes, because again, no armour upgrade either, so very much an easy target. And even if you do hit the Dunedain Peacekeepers, you have a fairly decent chance of killing them, to be honest with you. Dunedain have that elven quality to them, where once they get into melee, their Dunedain nature really does become outright positive, but they do pay for it in other ways. Like, their armour is not quite as strong as units of that cost would be from other human kingdoms. Alcarondas Legion would be a pretty good example of that. Again, this sort of upper end, more premium line infantry unit. Well, if they're coming forward here, this is going to be interesting if he doesn't back out of this. He's going to get in there. It's going to be a big charge, but he's also going to connect with a lot of the Tarnostian Spearmen as well. But the Brotherhood of the Lance have got such a big charge, they actually did do a lot of damage carrying forward into the Tarnostian Spears as well. Interesting this. The Royal Court of House Armlaith have been caught by the Wain Riders and the Nurad Retainers. I'm very surprised actually Khan didn't stay in there. Melee cavalry don't have the biggest charge anyway. You may as well try, if he surrounded them there, if he used the melee cavalry as they're intended to be, where you sort of stay in melee with them, they could have actually done even more damage there, and more cavalry pressure would have been taken off them in the late game. And again, I do like the red team's composition more, but it is entirely reliant on them not allowing the blue team's heavy hitters to really get any value. In comes the Arthedain army, a little bit further ahead of Dol Amroth. I think Dol Amroth, maybe dragging his heels just a bit. If Arthedain is committing to a melee fight over here, and speaking of which, there is a fight going on over in this direction as well. Knights of Innuminus are over here finishing off some of the Wayne Riders of Khan. Obviously a very one-sided engagement. That they may be melee cavalry, but knights are a whole different beast on horseback. If you're going to bring them down like that, you need a lot of numbers, and a single depleted unit of Wayne Riders wasn't going to be that. Arthedain getting very close here. Of course, their blackguards are lining up for a shot as well, and they are going to throw a volley of javelins into the front of that front line. And again, good amount of kills on Dunedain Peacekeepers and Arthedain Pikemen there. They don't have a lot of ammunition this, but I mean, a lot of good damage going on there. The Wardens of the North are firing in. They will do a decent amount of damage to whatever they decide to go after. I think actually it's about time we go down to half speed, to be honest with you, because I imagine Dol Amroth are going to need to, again, they've been caught a little bit flat-footed here. I always say, like, if you see your teammate doing something, you do need to be, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, you will be doing more damage to yourself in the long run if you can do something completely different to them. And that's why I think a lot of players like playing defensive, because then like there's no real danger of that, and that's obviously what Khan and Umbar have done. But Khan and Umbar also design their compositions around one another more so, whereas Arthedain and Dol Amroth are a little bit more autonomous entities here, which it could pay off in the long run, but Arthedain here are going to need some big support here. Dol Amroth's cavalry is a long way off again. Evandim archers coming in, Dunedain Trollslayers as well, so a unit that was hiding. Significant one as well, because they're so strong in melee as well as doing a lot of damage, similar in many ways to the damage the Corsair Blackguards can do at range, but they offer a lot more in melee than the Corsair Blackguards do. Dol Amroth starting to push in as well. Nomadic Raiders getting into a position to try and push back against them, but I mean, I would say it is definitely within, I would say it's within the red team's, they should be trying to focus Arthedain down here, and it's actually a little bit surprising here that they've allowed Arthedain into the flank like this, because now the Knights of Numinous are going to get their lances down. They're going to do a lot of damage to the Nurad Footman. It's a little bit risky because there are Nurad Halberdiers in there as well, which could end up doing a fair amount of damage. In come the Veriad Cataphracts. I mean, they could trap them in here. I mean, this is going to result in the end of a few of these Knights of Numinous, and actually they didn't end up charging in. Like, it wasn't a particularly good charge, it wasn't a clean one. The Nurads are actually losing on the front line, so it does go to show there's a good amount of quality from Arthedain with the Dunedain and with the Dismounted Knights of Numinous. A second unit of Troll Slayers as well, so goes to show Arthedain did go quite heavy in for their Dunedain units, a lot of their quality. And with their Dismounted Knights on the front line as well, they ended up losing quite a few Knights of the Numenors. Arthedain will lose the longer this fight remains unchanged, I think, though, because, again, there's Brotherhood of the Shadows getting closer in there as well. Need to be a little bit careful, the Veriad Cataphracts. Out come the Alcarondas Faithful, chasing off this cluster of Arthedain Cav. There's still the Khandish Cavalry over on the other side. They're pulled back after taking a few bites out of some of the Dol Amroth forces. Dol Amroth coming forward now. Doran Ernil Swordsman en masse, but that won't really worry the front line all that much. Doran Ernil Swordsman will probably rout pretty quickly, to be honest with you, against the fairly hefty Umbar infantry. These Knights of the Silver Swan are sort of, again, they're hanging around back here looking for a good opening. They can't really go this way because there's so many pikemen. They could try and squeeze through that gap. It would be pretty risky, and it would also get in the way of his allies' javelins, but it is a potential way in, a way in that doesn't have knights patrolling it either back here. Speaking of which, the Alcarondas Faithful have managed to get into close melee combat, which should suit them down to the ground, even with some of these Dunedain scouts around to support the Knights of Numinous. Like, this is where the Alcarondas Faithful will really earn their keep. And the Knights of Numinous, as tanky as they are, they're not quite as highly specialised at fighting against other cavalry as the Alcarondas Faithful are, especially not with Veriad Cataphracts coming in here. That would be the end of the Arthedain Cav. But Arthedain are making gains in other places, to be fair. These Dunedain Trollslayers are wrapping around the lines. The Brotherhood of the Shadows, I would imagine, are probably going to target them with their throwing daggers. Indeed they are. Which will do a fairly hefty amount of damage to the units that they hit. I mean, again, a little bit static, this. And this could come down to the fact that, you know, they have to hold their position elsewhere. Umbar, mainly. And Khand, with a lot of archers, with a lot of cavalry, don't have quite the same level of support. So coming forward now, their greatest strength in many ways, in the sense that they design their faction compositions around one another, could turn out to be a bit of a weakness in the end. And a lot of that could come down to positioning, because they have left themselves some flanks that are a little bit exposed. The Dunedain Trollslayers being allowed to get in there after the charge. You can see they're actually starting to really struggle over here. Alcarondas Faithful patrolling around with the Brotherhood of the Shadows and the Balakath Axe Guard coming in. That should change a little bit. I think the Shadows actually should do fairly well against the Troll Slayers, especially with some support from the Variag Bowman. Positioning of the archers could be a little bit better here from Khand, I think. Royal Court of House Armlaith heading around the flank. Unfortunately for them, they barged right through some stakes. They did actually lose some unit models there. Meanwhile, Wain Riders of Khand and Murad Retainers, once again, more of Khan's effectively chaff being thrown in the way, but they are really going to get put in a corner by the Haven Knights, especially with supporting spears on the way, but they're buying time. The Haven Knights will be less of a presence behind the line again. Look at this. Once again, they came through and then they tried to retreat once again and charge through the stakes again. So the Royal Court of House Armlaith, the comedy of errors there. What could have been a really dangerous unit actually, almost completely defanged at this point. Dol Amroth still have some reserves that they can commit forward, but they can't afford to be too frugal at this point. They need to be at least closer to the action, so when the time comes to commit them, they can be more responsive. For Dol Amroth's assault, it's going slightly worse. I mean, Doran Ernal's Swordsman making up the bulk of it means that perhaps shouldn't be all that surprising. Untitled Champions, I mean, they should do pretty well against a lot of these Umbar units. If not for the pikemen, they would probably actually be fairly dominant in a fight like this. Again, more Troll Slayers wrapping around the flanks, and the fact that there have been these gaps that the blue team have been able to sort of crunch in from the sides of these lines on has been a real boon for them. But on the front line here, especially in the middle of these lines, especially where those Corsair Blackguards did some damage, the Arthedain line is starting to crumble a little bit, so that will allow Umbar to then just shift the position a little bit. There is still the small matter of the Wardens of the North. It'd be interesting to see what they're firing at actually. Of course, armour-piercing archers, very dangerous. They're going after the Alcarondas Faithful. A good choice actually, because they're one of the few units that the Haven Knights will probably be slightly concerned about, but with the numbers being what they are, Haven Knights shouldn't have too much to worry about there. Nomadic Infantry out of ammunition again, in much the same way as the Bardian Marksman and the Balakith Marksman. Decent in melee, as the name infantry would suggest, so the fact that they're coming in to sort of shore things up will make the front lines a little bit more secure. The real danger is still from the Dol Amroth cavalry though, like they're still on the periphery here. The time will come, I think, where the Dol Amroth player needs to roll the dice. Even if he's under archer fire, he just needs to get in here and start doing some damage. That's the whole point behind bringing Lancers. You need to be prepared to sort of really dive in and start doing some real damage, because the longer they leave it, the more Arthedain's army is starting to look really, really haggard. I mean, you can see here the Dunedain Troll Slayers are doing a good job at sort of squishing in from the side here, but the only support they really have at this point are very depleted pikes and Evendim archers who are not good in melee. Certainly no match for Alcarondas Legion. Even Balakith and Belagai units are going to have no issues at all dealing with Evendim in melee. Corsair Blackguards getting around the flanks, so now it's the red team's turn to find some gaps in behind the lines. Variag Bowman, I mean, they're not bad in melee either. They're not quite the same as nomadic infantry, but I mean, a lot of these sort of beefier archers, like when they do run out of ammunition, they're fairly beefy in melee as well, which gives you just that little bit of extra staying power. Which again is why I'm not displeased by this red team composition by any means. But the danger, of course, is that showstopper units like big lancers can still do some damage. Interesting, actually, Variag Cataphracts and Alcarondas Faithful against Haven Knights. It will be quite interesting here to see who comes out on top of this. A charge coming in from the Variag Cataphracts. Whoever wins this, I think it will be close, and neither side will really come out of it with too much left to show for it. I mean, the Alcarondas Faithful taking some damage off the charge, actually. Nomadic Raiders coming in to try and bog them down in melee as well, which will make a bit of a difference. Haven Knights actually proving themselves to be very strong in melee there, doing very nicely. As perhaps should be expected, there's a lot of damage that's been done to Dol Amroth, Doran Ernal here. You can also see that I think that must come from the Corsair Blackguards shredding through the Dol Amroth lines. I mean, they do have another wave that they can send forward, in fairness, but also Alcarondas Legion are in behind the lines now, making Dol Amroth's advance much messier than it would otherwise have been. And if you can delay the Haven Guard from getting to the front line, Dol Amroth definitely, infantry is a bit messy, but at this point, I mean, the cavalry has charged on in here, but unfortunately I think they charged mostly into the backs of their Dunedain Troll Slayers there. There's only a few of them left, but I mean, to be fair, Arthedain's still hanging on over on this side. They can't afford to blob up their cav like this. They need to separate the two units, and they need to start charging into the position over here, because I think this is a bit of a problem. At this point, it's more and more looking like, yes, they still have their cav, still going to do some damage with that. Haven Knights running away from the Nomadic Raiders. but they're going to have to heavily rely on individual units of quality, and in particular from Dol Amroth, purely because Arthedain at this point have taken a bit of a beating, but something like the Haven Knights are going to be pretty difficult to bring down. I mean, there's Parathor champions in there as well, but for the red team, they have stuff like pikes to keep them at arm's length for a long period of time. They can wrap up every other theatre of war on the battlefield here, and then they can focus on trying to just overwhelm the Haven Guard. Balakathak's Guard, they're shaken. There's not much in the way of Dunedain Troll Slayers left, but there's still some good stuff on the front line. There's 23 Troll Slayers, that's not bad. Arthedain Men-at-Arms in decent numbers. The Peacekeepers are actually still in decent numbers as well, so a decent holdout of Arthedain units over here, but a lot of AP coming from the Nurad Halberds and from the Balakathak's Guard. They're going to need a lot more support from the cavalry. The cavalry needs to cycle out, and it needs to get some real momentum up for the charge. Unfortunately, however, Dol Amroth's infantry is not going to last much longer, and if the cavalry doesn't get some big charges off now to really start clawing things back, it's going to get out of control for the blue team, and they're not going to be able to pull it back. They're going to need big charges. Those Corsair Blackguards did terminal damage to those Athlon Halberdiers on the front line. And that does go to show something interesting, actually. Like the red team, they've really only gotten around the flanks with a couple of units, and this being one of them. But it really did a lot of damage, a ton of damage, in fact. Whereas the blue team have done it fairly consistently, they just haven't been able to make it stick. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Arthedain and Dol Amroth, they advanced at separate times. Everything was a little bit disjointed. Gaps did appear as a result, but Dol Amroth never really has taken advantage of that with the cavalry. And I think, as we go back up to 1 speed, I feel fairly comfortable in saying that I think the red team is going to go on to win this, to be honest with you. There's also the Brotherhood of the Lance in the backline, so even with Lancers, where the blue team really should have had the advantage, the Brotherhood of the Lance are doing that to them as well, cleaning up some of the Door and Ernal archers. They're going to get into melee, but it's not going to help them all that much. These Knights of the Silver Swan really need to just start careening down through here. There are still pikes present, but at this point you need to just take a chance and start doing some heavy shock damage. And now a lot of the Door and Ernal units are starting to rout. The Haven Guard are the only thing that's left fighting in that mess. The Veriag Bowmen are going to break the charge of the Knights of the Silver Swan, but that's going to cost them pretty dearly. Some of the Knights of the Silver Swan get through over here. They're going to get sort of surrounded by infantry and pikes and pulled down. Yeah, and you can see this is the problem, like too much of the Dol Amroth infantry has now fled or is dead from the javelins. And at this stage they've left it a little bit too late, Dol Amroth, to spring their cavalry. There was a period of time where this cavalry, these kind of charges, could have been more useful. And actually they didn't leave it too late really, they just chose the wrong target to charge into. They blobbed up, not all that impressive in terms of cavalry play, and I think again the blue team were just too disjointed here. Whereas the red team, much better teamwork from them. They built their compositions to complement one another very nicely, and they used it pretty well. I would say that they were defensive. It's perhaps slightly easier to have more of a static position. Like it demands more of you to move forward and be aggressive and position your units correctly. But what I would also say to counterpoint that is they earned the right to be more defensive because they invested so heavily in units that would allow them to do that. Khan had so many archers that they really were unable to sort of answer that, the blue team. And when they saw that, they should have been thinking, okay, we're going to need to be aggressive in some way. Someone's pinging me on Discord. No matter. But yeah, that really was the issue there. Like, I think they wanted to maybe take their time just a little bit, the blue team, feel their way into the battle. They had some archers that were designed to be efficient. Nothing more, a courteous skirmish fight they were hoping for. And then later on, when they didn't have to worry so much about that, they could then use their heavy-hitting cavalry. It didn't work out that way, and I don't think they had much of a plan B. Arthedain moved forward, kind of did okay. I mean, they definitely found some gaps on the flank, but they weren't able to make it stick. I do think Dol Amroth, when they saw Arthedain moving forward, should have been prepared to do the same. It would have been more likely then that the cavalry could have been used to good effect. Because honestly, the red team cavalry was just there to get in the way, and they did that effectively. Again, like I said, Khan almost played an ablative armour kind of role here, and then Umbar was the hard centre that ultimately, even with Arthedain's flanking, Dol Amroth getting a couple of charges off, they weren't able to break entirely. And it worked out very nicely, actually, I have to say. I did like the red team composition here. Damaged, of course, as they are. Like, not much cavalry left, really, just the Brotherhood of the Lance and some Alcarondas Faithful, and that's pretty much it. But fine margins. And I think this does go to show the advantage that sort of really talking through your composition with your ally gives you. And again, like Khand, it's not a glamorous job to be what is effectively, you know, the shield, but it allowed Umbar, who filled the role of the sword here, to do exactly what they needed to do. And I think, again, teamwork does come into this. I think that Arthedain and Dol Amroth really didn't have an answer. Like, they clearly had a way they wanted to play. They wanted to do, like I said, a sort of a light opening skirmish fight that they could take their time with a bit more. And then later on, open up into the cavalry. They were forced back in the skirmish fight so heavily that I think they panicked a little bit. I do think, actually, though, that Arthedain had the right idea. They moved forward more aggressively. I think Dol Amroth was the one that was dragging their heels just a little bit more, and I think a little bit more urgency, a little bit more speed was needed from them, because again, those Knights of the Silver Swan, they blobbed up, and even in the situation we had, they could have got some pretty significant charges. But I think a little bit earlier on, you know, spreading them out a bit more, getting some good charges in, that could have been the difference here, and that could definitely have turned the fight around. Let's see what did the damage for Dol Amroth, though. I can't imagine, because of the unit scaling, that many units got huge amounts of kills. So you do have to bear that in mind. Like, considering it was a lower unit scaling, you know, there was only 4 armies on the field. Khand as well had a fairly hefty cavalry presence, so that obviously affects the amount of men they have on the field. Umbar, of course, have got superior infantry, so it's always going to be difficult for Dol Amroth to rack up a huge kill count here outside of their lancers. And their lancers were the thing that got the most kills, even as misused, I think, as they were. 87, 48 was a little bit lower, perhaps. Haven Knights did okay, obviously, again, real monsters on horseback in a cav versus cav fight. The rest of it, obviously, infantry, again, a little bit. There's nothing wrong with having some stuff in reserve. They were a little bit far away, though. And if you send Doran Ernil Swordsman with only basic support around them, Umbar's going to destroy them. So yeah, definitely room for improvement for the blue team here. I think more in terms of teamwork more than anything else, but deciding when to commit and also having a plan B. You know, going into a battle here, I think it was fairly obvious that they didn't really have that. They had a way they wanted to play. The red team composition rendered that kind of impossible without taking just ridiculous losses at the hands of the Khandish archers. And they didn't really have a way to react to that, or at least it didn't seem that way. The red team, on the other hand, that was pretty good, I have to say. I like the composition, I like the way they played with one another. I like the fact that that is how to play defensively. Like, I'd say that against some of the players who have been playing Reforged for quite a while, they probably would have been able to take advantage of the gaps that were in the red team formation there. That, to be fair, the blue team did kind of do, Arthedain more so than Dol Amroth, but they did kind of take advantage of some of those gaps. I feel as though some best players maybe would have been able to do that a little bit more so, which is worth bearing in mind. Like, there were gaps in the formation. Khan's archers were a little bit static, and I do feel as though those are areas that could also see improvement, but I like it. And I do feel as though that, you know, Khand and Umbar do synergize very well with one another, with the strengths. Umbar with the quality, the infantry. They've got quality on horseback as well, but they can't bring it in the same kind of numbers as Khand, obviously. And Khand, with their archers, some cheaper units, but in particular, they're really numerous cavalry. Really, them and Rohan can obviously bring far more cavalry in terms of numbers than anyone else. It can be a pretty difficult thing to sort of pick your way through if you build the composition right. And obviously, I think, actually, it would be even more interesting if you traded in the Wain Riders, the unshielded melee cavalry, for instead a couple of units of basic horse archers as well, because I think that would make it even more of a serpentine web to try and sort of navigate your way through, because it's so many things that can just slowly eat away at you from Khand. But if you commit yourselves too quickly into a situation you're not prepared for, Umbar will eat you alive. So yeah, come into my parlour, said the spider to the fly. Yeah, an interesting battle to say the least, actually. I'm quite glad I covered it in the end. Obviously, again, it's grassy plain, but don't shout at me too much for grassy plain. Hopefully people enjoyed this, because again, this is the sort of thing which smaller scale pitch battles do offer you a little bit more tactical nuance than a siege, where very often it will turn into a game of hurdles over a few choke points, essentially. Which for the spectacle of things is fine, but it is quite exhausting to narrate your way through a lot of the time. Whereas this, a little bit, you know, it's quicker, so it doesn't quite take it out as much of me in terms of stamina to do multiple recordings in one day. Not that that's an issue today anyway, because I can only do the one, and a small one at that. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. We'll see how it's received. I mean, I can't imagine it's going to do as well as the bigger sieges, which is why you don't see as much of these. Even though I do get sent a fairly steady stream of sort of basic pitch battles between like 1v1s and 2v2s. I do get sent them, but I don't use them terribly often just because of that. It's not like I don't appreciate people sending them in. That is the reason. Like, the numbers do not lie. As much as people in the comments may say, you know, we will watch it, the numbers disagree, and that's just the cold hard truth. So we'll see how well this one does. But yeah, as for what is coming in the near future, we'll continue doing these, of course. Like I said, the channel update video is sort of like a looming spectre on the horizon. Like, as soon as I know a little bit more about what's going to be happening sort of towards the tail end of summer into early autumn, and into what is potentially a new academic term for me. I'm technically in an academic term, but it's a bit weird, obviously. Like, I'm sure anyone who's in university or higher education of any kind can testify to this, that at the moment it's a bit messy. There's a little bit of it's not exactly a lot of clarity going around at the moment, although I do have kind of an idea about what's going to happen, just because I've kind of had a look and step back from the situation myself, and I believe that I will be doing a semester in the autumn. Even though I was supposed to graduate in September, I think that things will sort of be shunted back a semester, and more or less summer will be just any sort of proprietary work I can do that, or preparation work I should say, to do for that. I should be able to do over the summer. But other than that, the amount I'm going to be able to do is probably going to be fairly limited, especially for a course like mine where there's a lot of field and lab work required in order to do something. Like, you can do the data analysis on a home computer, of course, like we had to do for the tail end of the last semester, but for dissertation work, obviously you need to be able to get out into the field and use the boats and use the equipment, and then use the labs to analyse the data, and then you can do the data analysis stuff that I could do at home, but obviously that I need the data to be able to do that first. But yeah, that's kind of my thinking behind the fact that I feel as though it's very likely that I'm going to be at university until next early February 2021, I think is when I'm going to be leaving, which obviously does entail that certain things with regards to the channel. But I will be releasing a channel update to kind of when I know what's happening, because there is still a chance that I could finish for September, and that obviously will impact the channel in certain ways. But yeah, like I said, we'll see. I've kind of repeated myself a few times on that, but I think that that's a little bit more clarity to what's actually going on. But enough of my problems. The next one will probably be another siege. I think I have another siege that I was sent that I can do on my next recording session. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.